From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Kurt Dewhurst. I am the chair of the board of the trustees of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I really want to welcome you to this really very special event, something we've been looking forward to for actually a number of years as we started to think about our 40th anniversary. Today's roundtable discussion is part of the American Folklife Center's active year-round commitment to public programming, a commitment that includes, as many of you know, the Benjamin A. Botkin Lecture Series, the Homegrown Concert Series, and symposia on a wide range of topics, open mic interviews, and numerous other special events. These public programs form an important part of the Center's acquisitions activities. Each event is videotaped and becomes part of the library's permanent collections. In addition, the videos of these events are posted to the Library of Congress website, where they are available for viewing for internet patrons, certainly throughout the world. And we've been finding more and more that people are using these, which is very gratifying for us. As many of you know, this year, because we are celebrating our 40th anniversary of the American Folklife Center, we're doing a number of special activities. The center was created in 1976 by the U.S. Congress to preserve and present American folklife through programs of research, documentation, archival presentation, reference service, live performance, exhibitions, publications, and training. Designed by Congress as a national center for folklife, it continues to play an important role in the documentation, research, and the center continues to collect and document living traditional culture while preserving for the future its unparalleled archival collections and state-of-the-art preservation facilities of the Library of Congress that continually are upgraded, and we're very grateful for that opportunity to be able to make these collections so available now. In addition to its active public programming schedule, the Center Archive houses the largest ethnographic collection in the world. As of 2016, its holdings include more than 5 million items of ethnographic documentation that record folklore and traditional expressions of the United States and other nations throughout the world. The AFC Archives includes outstanding holdings of sound recordings of more than 350,000 hours in diverse formats and over 800,000 photographs, field notes and other manuscript materials, videotapes and other visual formats, and of course ephemera dating from the late 19th century through the present day. But the archive's peerless recordings didn't appear magically, as you know. Over the years, the center's growth and increasing prominence were guided by the dedicated efforts of its staff. And heading that staff are the center's current director and 2 former directors who are with us today. And for this discussion, we'll have a rich opportunity to be able to hear directly from them. And I might say they haven't had a chance to rehearse or prepare for how this might go, and I think they're as anxious to hear from one another. So I want to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Jabbour, who led the center from its beginning to from 1976 to 1999, Dr. Peggy Bulger, who headed the center from 1999 to 2012, and the current AFC director, Betsy Peterson, who assumed this leadership of the center in 2012. Now, before we welcome them officially, I'm going to turn over the proceedings to my colleague Cliff Murphy, who is the Director of Folk and Traditional Arts at the National Endowment for the Arts, and who has kindly agreed to serve as moderator for this roundtable discussion of the Center's historical initiatives and programs, as well as its future prospects. But before I do, I want to thank you again for coming today and for your interest in the unique cultural treasure that really is a cultural treasure of our nation, the American Folklife Center. Please join me in welcoming our panel and our moderator.
Hello, everybody. I'm Cliff Murphy, and it's my pleasure and honor to be up here and to moderate, though admittedly I imagine that I have the three tops here that once we let them go, they're just going to run their own course here. So I have an easy job of steering, right? And I may have to pat you on the shoulder, or
while we're spinning.
Yes, while you're spinning, to say, hey, let's let Betsy speak, for instance. Betsy being the junior, yes. So before we do that, and I'm sitting here thinking this is a really remarkable moment for all of us and for our discipline. I think that in the time, Alan, that you first took the helm of the center, over that time, we've had, I think, 7 sitting presidents, right? And yet we have 3 directors of the center. And I'm not even trying to be funny. I think that—
Wow, I never counted that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I think here in the audience, I see Barry Burgee and Dan Sheehy, so two of my 3 predecessors at the NEA and Folk and Traditional Arts are here. Let's give it up for them. And there's at least 2 directors of the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage here, Michael and Dan. You're a twofer, and there may be others here who have played that significant role in steering our federal partnerships. And what that says to me is that our field is in many ways still young, and yet we've, here we are at this moment where there's so much that we have to learn from each of you and from one another, and so I feel privileged to be up here on the stage with you, and somewhat terrified. So, as it should be.
We'll join you in that.
So, right, this is like bureaucratic field work on stage. But I wanted to start with Alan. I'm looking at the date of January 2nd, 1976. As the birth date of the center, and I know for many of us in the room here, we have worked in government, federal, state, county, city government, trying to create programs, and that's difficult, right? And so January 2nd is obviously maybe the birth date, but this whole process started a long time before that. I know that you were involved in starting the first state folklife programs while you were at the NEA. In 1974, and when I look at that time period in American history, that was a difficult stretch of time for the nation, and particularly for the government. At any moment in history, I think we think we're in a unique time, right? And so here we are at this particularly interesting period of American political and cultural history. There's a lot of churn and a lot of anxiety, and I think that this center was created at a similar moment in American history. And so I'm curious to know how that felt as the new director of this center, in terms of the conversations that you were having with the general public, with government agencies about why this mattered. Why did we need this? How could this be a unifying force? How did this gain political capital to happen in the first place? Obviously, it must have been seen as necessary.
Well, if it was necessary, we all thought so, but the world didn't think so. And on the other hand, people like Archie Green did help Congress to think so, and it did pass at the very end of '75, at the end of that session of Congress. And it was a turbulent times, but it also was a time where we were the last of a series of congressional actions that were cultural actions, including the creation of the 2 endowments in the '60s, the creation of the Historic Preservation programs. Archie said he kept running into the historic preservation guy who was lobbying Congress too when he was lobbying, and they got acquainted with each other that way. And so we were at the tail end of that, and no big ones that I can think of followed us. And on the other hand, I don't think there was plenty of people, of course, said, well, what's that going to be? Is that a waste? And in our field, there was maybe some anxiety about like, well, what's it going to do? We've already got grants from the Arts Endowment. We didn't have grants from the Humanities Endowment, or at least not in any focal and concerted way. So there was a challenge. We had a great program over at the Smithsonian that was a festival plus, because the festival itself had become a defining activity on the national landscape, literally and figuratively. And the program itself, of course, grew beyond the festival alone. And so some people might have wondered, well, what's the Folklife Center going to do? And a number of people in our field said, well, you can be coordinative. Coordination is an important thing, and I believe in it, but if that's your only job, you're not going to be able to get anybody to pay attention, in my opinion. And so you need some other things to have attention, and then you can coordinate more effectively. Or so I believed as the new director. And plus, we had to reassure the Library of Congress, which accepted the Folklife Center, but possibly with some misgivings, reassure them that we fit. And so I then launched a program focusing on field documentation, evoking as history the archive going all the way back to the 30s, well, to the 20s, really, with Robert W. Gordon, and evoking that as our tradition, which we're now reawakening. And so we started doing field documentation, but it wasn't, most field documentation in our field of folklore at that time was solo work. Maybe occasionally two people, but usually people working alone. And I was greatly taken by, the other fields who had mounted collective projects of a number of professionals with varying skills, even from different fields, anthropology, archaeology, and so forth. And I thought, well, we should do that too. Luckily, our field itself, which had started out focusing mainly on verbal oral traditions and had added music very early in the game, had started adding in a serious way material culture to verbal and musical traditions as what we as folklorists did. And so documenting material culture as well demanded photography and other media of documentation. Plus, documentation reassured the library that we were building collections. We were creating collections, which was what the library thinks of itself as doing, either creating collections or at least assembling the collections that others have created. The archive historically had done both, but had done both at a sort of a small gauge level. Even at that level, Alan Lomax figured out with his dad how to make a lot of people notice it and think about it. And so think of the possibilities if we did larger projects, including professionals of all persuasions and specialties, truly documenting folk life, in effect, defining folk life, not just by what we said, but by what we did in our documentation. maybe I better stop here.
Well, I want to ask you one quick personal question before we maybe start to spread out a little bit. And I've reminded our panelists here that they should feel free to ask one another questions too, because I feel like that would be interesting. Do you remember your first day on the job? What did it feel like walking in the door and here I am?
Actually, I do remember it, but it was an odd, lonely day because they didn't even know where to put me.
Some things never change.
And so the big question of the first day is, where will your seat be?
Yeah.
You couldn't even yet quite call it an office, but there was a small budget as well as me, and this was this August or September? It was the end of what was then the fiscal year that ended September 30th. And so this small budget, well, what do you do with a small budget when you're just you and don't even have an office? So maybe you could hire people, and I got busy hiring, but that takes dealing with the bureaucracy, which said, there's no such thing as a folklife specialist, And so we had to invent categories for the personnel world, So the one other thing we could do is buy documentary equipment. And my vision of what we should do was embedded in how I spent that small budget, in the waning days of fiscal year, whatever it was. 77.
That sounds like a good government worker right there, isn't
it? And also by doing that to define what we were going to do and where we were going to go.
So I'm going to try to segue to Peggy here. I know from reading your correspondence with George Carey in Maryland and the creation of that state folklife program there in the early 70s that you had some vision of the study of folklife, including many things that we think of as being in the humanities, vernacular architecture, for instance. Peggy, I know that when you came on board here that you began working a lot with occupational folklife and these sorts of things. So tell me a little bit about inheriting this program and this center and this mission. What did that feel like as you stepped in, and where did you want to go with it?
Well, first of all, I have to say it was really daunting. I remember finding out that I got the job and I was floored. But I have to say that anything I'm saying, really any accomplishments, really it's the staff. I mean, I inherited a wonderful staff. Unfortunately, we were going through a terrible time fiscally. We needed to fill positions. We had people still on the books who were dead. I'm not kidding, and so we really needed to gear up a little. They weren't pulling their weight, and so remember that. So anyway, and I mean, Alan's right. Some things never changed. Yeah, I came. There was no chair for me because Alan was still working. So either I had to push him out of the chair, which I think I did. I may just stay.
And they put me up in the rafters.
In the
above
rafters.
the main reading room.
Yeah.
Really a glorious seat.
Yeah. But when I came, I think, you got to realize there's such a difference between 1976 and 1999 in the field of folklore. I mean, it's like night and day. And mainly because the good work that had been done since 76 to 99, we now had a network of folklorists around the country who are doing those field projects using, I think, probably Alan and his staff and the big documentation projects as a model, which was great because, here are all these new programs being established. I was in one of them. I was in Florida. I guess I was the 6th state folklorist, and we would borrow the Nagras all the time, and that was another thing. I came and there's a bunch of unused Nagras that, all of a sudden everybody has their own equipment. So you have to we were rethinking what the center might do that nobody else could do. there was no reason to, I guess, not reinvent the wheel, but continue with the same wheel when you were so successful that everybody was doing great out there, and what could the center do? So I guess when I came, my first problem, and I think it's probably an ongoing thing, you're always fighting for the Folklife Center, whether it's with the library or Congress or whatever, you're fighting for resources. And as a director, I really knew that what I had to do was get enough resources so the staff could do their job. Because there's a great staff, but if you don't have resources, you can't do anything. And so we were able to hire, I think we doubled our staff. And, but we all had to fight for it. And we started thinking about where we were. Well, in the field also, let's face it, public folklore now had a 35-year trajectory, and all of those collections are out there. One, when a state would go out of business, when they would have their folklife program collapse, where did that material go? And unfortunately, a lot of times it goes into the basement of some state archive where it was, moldering away. So I've seen that. Yeah, I bet you have. So we were thinking about that. Of course, we were in the process of finalizing, and we did, the Alan Lomax collection coming here, which, started with Alan and continued. And that was a huge, to have the Lomax collection come, I think gave us a big shot in the arm as far as everybody saying, oh, well, maybe I want my stuff to be over there because it's Alan Lomax. And so we started getting interest from some of the scholars who were ready to retire, and they, their house was full of stuff, and they realized we got to do something with it. So we were able to really, I think, put an emphasis now not on field projects anymore. In fact, we didn't have any money to do field projects, and the other thing was we really thought that what we had in the archives was so important. It needed to be preserved better and get more staff to process it and then to get the collection. So I think in the first 5 years when I was here, we tripled the archive, the numbers. But now I just said it's now like within, I've only been gone 4 years, you already got 1 million more. You go, girl. You go, girl.
Well, I think we're just accurately counting.
Yeah, oh, that could be. That could be. It's all those files I left.
Can I tell a quick Peggy-related anecdote? When I was retiring from the center, I persuaded the library that I could help facilitate the transition to the new director. And so I was going to hang on if they could find a place to put me. But I talked to a bunch of colleagues and got, they made it clear to me that I wasn't going to get to choose which horse it would be. But then I thought, well, then the trick is to get good horses in the race. And so
that's right.
The personnel office at some point contacted me and said, well, we've got a number of applications, and they read off the names. And I said, oh, that's great. Oh, you got it? Oh, he came too. And then I realized it was all men, all the strong candidates. And so, though I didn't get Peggy her job, she got herself the job. I got her to apply, and I'm proud of that. And she did the best.
It's true. You really convinced me when you said, well, if you don't get the job, you'll get a free weekend in Washington. That sounded good to me.
That was a trip that worked out well,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, very great. Yeah. Anyway, so in a nutshell, though, I think each, you could look at each decade, really, and the way that the field has grown, the center, I think, needs to respond to what's happening. And the other thing I have to say is that we were navigating digital collections for the first time and had to really fight for certain things, like our Facebook page. I remember Dr. Billington being outraged that we wanted to have a Facebook page. You know, this was, no, we couldn't have a Facebook page. And so, needless to say, thanks to Steve Winnick, we have a great Facebook page to this day, but it took a long time to, you know, the library is a big old ship that really, you know, it's a great ship, but it is, it's not very nimble on its feet, ever.
Well, now as the Thomas Jefferson of the presidential sequence here,
Good one.
thank you. Though Adams was only there very briefly, your tenure was long and illustrious. Tell me, how was that experience? You know, coming into a position where you know, you are preceded by two people of significant stature in the field, and to kind of take those reins. How did that feel, and where are we now? You know.
You tell me. No, I called Peggy on the end of my first day on the job, and sort of in more colorful language said, how did I get myself into this? But no, it's been wonderful, and I right now we are in the midst of digitizing some collections that go back to Alan's time, the field surveys that started in the 70s, and I'm just getting reacquainted with all of that material now. I'm just in awe and amazed at what the staff was able to accomplish in the 70s. I'm also continually reminded now about just the changes that are happening, the changes that Peggy, I think, begins to describe, which I think do mirror the changes and the maturation or trajectory of the field as a whole. And I do think that Alan and the first generation really focused on doing a lot of documentation, going out and actively creating material for the archive that really did, I mean, continue a tradition, a long, very illustrious tradition of Lomaxes and Bakken and Gordon and everyone. And I think when Peggy and I began to come along, and I think it's just really, it's sort of an acceleration with me, is that this shift from going out and actually doing the work to eliciting the work, I think, began to happen. And I think it began to happen for a few reasons, money being one. And I came in after the recession and all of that, and also faced a lot of shrinking budgets as well. But I think, you know, as I came along, it also was about the issue of who owns culture, who speaks for culture, who does field work, and I think it sort of points to the benefits and the limitations of federal government. I think we can do certain things, but I think for our field, and I think for me at a certain point, it does become an issue of, does somebody going out and doing field work in a community they don't really know very well, ultimately, and may not be staying for very long, how effective are they going to be versus someone who lives and grows up in a particular community and has expertise? And I think also as our field grew, there were more and more people with equipment, more and more people who can do field research, more and more folklorists, ethnomusicologists, cultural anthropologists, oral historians, and on and on and on. So, I mean, we have an incredible array of people all over the country, all over the world, that we can work with now. And it was interesting, we just finished a board meeting this morning, and we talked about fellowships. And it's interesting, when I did my dissertation totally with field equipment borrowed from the American Folklife Center, with Noggards, borrowed from Carl. And that was an incredible strategy at that point when equipment was so expensive that nobody could have access to that kind of professional recording equipment without a program like that. So it was unbelievable. It really helped a generation of people, I think. In the same way now that I think the Archie Green Fellowships, which started under Peggy, and other fellowship programs, the Parsons, the Reed, which Alan started, and Blanton Owen. Those are, I think, more appropriate strategies for now. They are encouraging field work. They are encouraging people to go out into communities and do extended, serious, in-depth field research in a way that we couldn't do. We just wouldn't be able to do it. The money's not there, the resources aren't there. And I think those are the kinds of strategies. I do think that's one of the differences between the beginnings of the center and where we are now in 2016. I also think, for me, Peggy mentioned digitization and digital media, and it certainly, that shift was happening under Peggy. It's only accelerated, at warp speed now, and that actually, for us, or for me, one of the central issues or thrusts that I think, or directions the center has to take, is to really aggressively digitize its material, to really aggressively get it up online and get it available. And that means several things. I mean, just digitizing something doesn't make it available. There's a whole bunch of other steps and work that has to go into that. And I'm committed, the staff is committed to really moving very actively in that direction. We have so much material that you either have to come here or it's really not all that accessible, period. And that's, it's a shame. It's, we've brought all this unbelievable material in. Now we've got to get it out, and let people see what we have. That's one of the major missions we have. We also will continue and do continue to bring in new collections, as Peggy mentioned again, many scholars, nonprofit organizations who were a major engine for field research in this country in the 70s and 80s. Many of them are beginning to, looking at these collections and realizing, gee, we've amassed all sorts of stuff. What are we going to do with it? And nobody can get to it. So we are beginning to actively work with those organizations as well. And I think those will also continue to just enrich the archive. But those are some of, I think, the trajectory or some of the differences that I see.
Yeah. Well, the NCTA collection.
Yeah.
Sure.
And the Center for Traditional Music and Dance collection just came to us last year.
So I'm struck by, all three of you started out your careers in the field, right? You've each done a significant amount of field work, important field work, and in time you were sucked into desk work in a rather significant way, right? And I know that in the kind of the day-to-day administrative work of an organization like the American Folklife Center or program, there's a lot to manage, right? And I imagine that along the way there must be moments that you say, this is why we do this, right? And are there moments that come to mind where that crystallize the mission and the purpose of this work, that you can kind of look back and reflect on? Are there?
You want to start?
Well, the many moments. It's hard to pick one out. At the public level, some of the accomplishments in our era included luring Rosalind Carter, to an exhibit we had at the library with Amy Carter, and it's nice getting the president's wife.
Were they in the Carter family? Is that?
Yeah, the Carter
We
family.
didn't get the whole Carter family. And then when we did our American Cowboy exhibit, we got President Reagan to come to bless it, as it were, in the big reception and opening. And so in terms of our public visibility and the reassurance that that gave the institution that we were on the right track, you know, those were high moments. Field moments, of course, I picture in the field. I didn't get to really do field work in our field projects. I was already the desk guy, but they let me come and sniff, you know, at the beginning and maybe in the middle once, you know. And so I went down to South Georgia when we were doing our project there and couldn't resist asking around, are there any fiddlers around here, you know? And sure enough, we got directed. And Carl and I went down to visit a fiddler, John R. Griffin, in Lenox, Georgia. And one of my magic moments, oddly, is with me playing the fiddle. We were recording him playing the fiddle, but he also knew how to beat the straws, and he didn't do it with 2 straws. He did it with just 1 straw, beating on the strings while the fiddle was being played. I don't have time to explain how you can beat a straw when it's just 1 straw, but it can be done, and he did it. And to demonstrate it, of course, I had to play the fiddle. And of course, Carl was documenting it. And so there are wonderful photos of me fiddling, John R. Griffin beating a straw on the fiddle and on his front porch. And to me, that's field work. And since I'm a field work man, that sums me up. But it's kind of an untruth because it suggests that I was busy doing field work myself at the Folklife Center, whereas a lot of the work was fighting with people about budgets and congressional hearings and staff issues,
the fun
personnel issues, you know,
Right.
all the things that bureaucrats need to do, and which we happily did, but we can't claim it was fun every minute of
Right.
it.
How about for you, Peggy?
Well, you know, I'm thinking about this. I think some of the best moments were also some of the worst. So, and I think about one of the things that happened early on when I came, Barry Burgee and I were asked to go to a conference in Beijing. It was the very first conference on intellectual property as it pertained to folklore. And we were representing the United States. And it began a trajectory that I realized the American Folklife Center, which sits in an institution that has the Copyright Office, needed to be at the table when I couldn't believe that there were people out there at the WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, who were debating these cultural issues, and none of them were, they were all lawyers. They were either patent lawyers or copyright lawyers. There were very few, and certainly on the American delegation, there were no content experts. And so I became one of the first content experts and sat through agonizing meetings. But in the end, I think it was very important because if nothing else, we were able to do a project with Tom Rankin and Guha, went to Kenya, working with people who document their own cultural traditions so that they could maintain control over what was happening to their lives. And even though we don't really know whether that was very, you know, ultimately long-term successful, where it was successful, they still talk about that project in Geneva at these meetings where they're talking about who owns culture, you know, and I mean, I could get into some really funny stories about the discussions, but I think it was very important that a folklorist be on the American delegation.
Yes.
I mean, you know, it was surprising to me that we weren't.
Yeah.
So that work continues on, along with all the work that's going on with UNESCO, and there's a lot of overlap between what's happening. But I think that was one of the things I said, that's what the American Folklife Center could do that somebody at the state level or a local level would not have the gravitas, I represent the federal government, So it was tough, but I actually enjoyed it. That's my weirdness.
That's great.
And Betsy, how about you? Is it too soon?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this job was that I knew that we are in the midst of a massive generational shift in the field, and every which way you can think of, we are. And for me, that was one of the exciting things, to be able to participate in that, to be able to work, and if any small way, have a voice in talking about where this field, this center would go, and that was exciting to me. A sort of more three-dimensional, and I guess more organizational sort of way. I mean, by the time I came here, and I came here much later in my life than Alan or Peggy, and so, which was probably a good idea, because it would have been much more difficult, I think. I wouldn't have had the patience. Because things do move much more slowly. But I think being able to get new staff, be able to begin thinking about, for instance, working with the federal cylinders, the federal cylinder project, and begin to reimagine what that might be in the 21st century. I mean, that is really exciting. And I should also say that for me, and in large part because of Alan and then Peggy, I think Alan really had to face a lot of fights with the library, all the authorization and reauthorization fights. I didn't have to do that, and Peggy barely had to do that. And that actually, I think, made a big difference. I also think, for me, I actually feel pretty supported by the library administration. We do have to fight for resources, as every other division does, but I actually feel that we're in pretty good shape compared to some of the other divisions here in the library, and I think they actually do, at least the current administration, really, I think, values what we do and what we bring. And same with the Veterans History Project. I do think we are sort of hybrid divisions. We are actively, bringing in material, actively soliciting material, and still doing field research as well, unlike a lot of other divisions who are primarily dealing with books, serials, and the like. So we're actively doing programming. We're not just a collections division, we're also a programming division. And we're also trying to move more aggressively into work with digital media. And I think we're sort of showing the way, actually, for the library, and I think the library kind of knows that.
Yeah, we're like an R&D outfit for the Library of Congress.
No, we are.
And
we
have
are.
been actually for a good while. You know, Carl was really
from
one
the
of the
beginning.
first people to experiment with the possibilities of digitizing collections to share them. So.
No, and that's true. Actually, one of the associate librarian at our board meeting that just finished was talking about how I think the AFC has always been recognized as trying to be, or being on the cutting edge of technology, and try and grapple with technology in the work that we do. And from Carl and Alan on up to now, I think that has continued to be the case.
Well, I should say, I'm looking into the audience here, and I know people have some questions. I'm also struck by, I know that I see Kathy Kirst and Carl Fleischauer, and there may be others who have worked for all three of you. So
there's Judith back there.
Yeah, Judith, right? Jennifer, right? So you have kind of collaboratively assembled a staff over that time. So I do want to say congratulations on putting together an extraordinary staff here at the American Folklife Center. Now, before I turn you over to your current and former staff for interrogation, do you have questions for one another?
Oh.
Or maybe you do this secretly over the phone.
Well, I'm a couple of questions. One, are there things that you wanted to accomplish or things that you started that were left undone that you would have liked to have achieved? And to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of being in a federal agency and trying to do what we do. I mean, for me, coming from a background of working in nonprofits most of my life, I'm used to having no resources, but I'm also was used to being more nimble and flexible in what I was able to do, and to also be more, you can be a little bit more edgy when you're in a nonprofit and kind of push in areas that for a federal agency is more difficult and may not be the role of a federal agency. That, and I'm just curious how you all feel about those two questions.
Well, regarding what I didn't accomplish, and happily, Peggy picked up where I left off on acquiring major collections, because that was one thing that I retired feeling that we had acquired collections, including some important cylinder collections, and there we acquired them because we had somebody who could do something with cylinders, and most institutions didn't, So that was helpful, but Peggy picked up on the Alan Lomax collection, and in a way, I think picked up on the idea of shifting more energy and emphasis into collections acquisition as a major thrust, and which I think was the right moment for it, and she did the right thing there, but it also bailed me out on things like that.
Yeah, well, and I guess for me, actually, I really wish that we could have sewn up the Seeger collection while I was, Pete and Toshi are friends, and it was just.
Don't give up.
Yeah, I know. It was just I wish it could have been, while I was still there to celebrate it while they were still alive. But some things don't happen that way. And there's always things that you didn't get to finish. But the good news is the center continues, just like Alan said. And so the things that are meant to be will continue, and they will get done. Yeah. It is. And I know, I can just remember, just trying to get, I came from the Southern Arts Federation here, and even that, that was a nonprofit, and just trying to get a contract through could be. So anything that we did actually was a real accomplishment, because we got through Napoleon and whatever his name was over at the contracts office, which was like Napoleon and Lafayette. There were two men.
Really?
Yes, I kid you not.
Was this when the AFC was in Europe?
No.
So maybe this is a good point to turn things over to the audience. Do people have questions? I imagine. Brave souls. Anyone? Sure.
Wow.
What happened with state programs? At least when I was on the board. Oh, great.
No, wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Jean Gilman. I was on the board way back when with Alan in the early days. It was wonderful. But what has gone on between the American Folklife Center and the state level programs? Because my feeling was that they were on the rise, that there was a point when states were appointing their state folklorists. But in terms of the activities of the Folklife Center and the state programs, have you seen ups and downs in those relationships? Is that so? Maybe you could address that. Each of you, maybe.
Well, and let me say something, because I started my career as a state folklorist in Florida in 1976 when the center was started, and if it wasn't for the center, I don't know if the Florida Folklife program would be around, but it's now, you know, alive and well and continues on. I feel like the center at the time, and Betsy touched on this, was doing the right thing. We had the Nagras, thank God we had the Nagras from the Library of Congress, and we had support, and we could call on our state legislature and say, there is an American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and they were floored, you know. They couldn't believe it, you know. So I think that was really important. When I came in, of course, the programs were really well established. And I have to say, the rise of nonprofit organizations across the country is phenomenal, fabulous nonprofit organizations that have long history. And I think we started discussions, like with the National Council for Traditional Arts, on acquiring their collections, because they have now had 30 years, 40 years, in the case of NCTA, it's like 60 or 70 years of material that needs to be in the right place. And I think that a lot of state programs and a lot of nonprofits are looking at the AFC as being the home, really the preferred home for materials, ethnographic materials, because that's what we have. The resources we have are, I mean, look at this institution, and we have, you know, archivists and recordists, you know, just an amazing institution for keeping collections. So.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, that network is still there. It has certainly had its ups and downs, and Cliff could probably say whether he thinks it's in an up or a down
it's
swing
definitely
right
in an
now.
up. I think we feel all the time that it's in a down. But no, I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. I think that's part of the mindset of the discipline. But I would say that
occupational pessimism.
But I think we are in an up. Yeah.
Well, and also I think the state or more local regional programs, where they are now, is just much more diversified. They're not only in state arts agencies. In fact, I mean, that probably is becoming smaller, but they're in universities, they're in nonprofits, standalones, or humanities agencies. I mean, there's just, the tentacles have, you know, reached out. So it may not be this one group anymore.
Right. It's, I think, gotten a little more diversified. Right now there are 38 active state programs, and the rest of the NEA folk arts staff can check that figure. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy if it's higher. So, yeah. But I can say, as a former state folklorist, that also the AFC staff here was helpful in terms of working with us to make sure that our collections were organized and that they were safe and that they were processed properly and that they had a home, even if that home didn't wind up being the AFC, that they helped us to be good stewards of that material as well. So, other questions? Dan.
Great to see you all up there. It's a beautiful sight. Two things. First of all, the Nagra, I can't resist mentioning this stuff. I was a child of the Nagra era, and it was like, oh my God, if you have a Nagra just in your vicinity, it was a beautiful thing. I noticed the media director at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage often uses the Nagra as a doorstop these days. It's just kind of a nice juxtaposition of eras. Question is maybe two parts. One is that you've had some really notable successes in collaborations and taking things under your wing over the years. The Veterans History Project, the StoryCorps stuff that's really punched through out there and reached, I don't know how many millions, but I've also noticed, for me anyway, one of the advantages of projects like that is that it tends to be reflective of the changing demographics of our changing nation. And so the sort of the two-part question there is how you've seen, if you've seen kind of a feedback loop, as Alan used to say, Alan Lomax, of that success coming back and then benefiting the programs and the whole thing being a virtuous cycle. And the other is that, have you seen that as yourselves as an effective strategy of both capturing and engaging a broad diversity of American public, particularly?
Who wants to start?
Yes, yes, and yes.
I'll just say real quickly, and then I'll turn it over, is that absolutely, I'm glad you mentioned StoryCorps. That was one of the battles I fought tooth and nail with Dr. Billington about, that I thought it should come here. I know probably some people would disagree with that, but the one thing that I have to say is that every Friday morning, the American Folklife Center Library of Congress was on NPR on Morning Edition, and even today, people will ask me, I'm retired, I'm in Florida, they'll say, well, what did you do? I said, oh, I was director of the American Folklife Center. Oh, StoryCorps. They know, if nothing else, they have that, you know, and then they actually have an idea about kind of what I was about in terms of talking to people. So yeah, I think that's one of the important things.
Well, I mean, sort of going back to this kind of federal government nonprofit sort of thing, for me, we continue working with StoryCorps, and StoryCorps continues to innovate. And I think for us going forward to develop new projects, work in new directions, we're gonna have to work with third parties. They are those creative engines that can push into areas that may be difficult for us to do, or may take us forever to do. And that's probably more the accurate description, but we will need to work with those folks. It is getting us out into different directions, certainly, I mean, oral history is a much bigger part of what we do. I mean, oral history was always, I mean, it's sort of intertwined with folklore, and ethnomusicology is just sort of part of the mix of things, but as a separated or separate thing unto itself, it's becoming more and more prominent in our work. And that may be just sort of the time as well. I'd be curious to see if that's happening elsewhere. Yeah, it's diversifying our methods and the populations that we're working with. I don't know.
I can't add to that. I think that's true, and you guys did great, and thank you for fighting for StoryCorps. That was a good fight.
I think the archivists are saying, whoa. No, because it actually, it's a difficult collection to manage.
I'm curious if we talked about unfinished business and all, but I'm wondering too if you have thought about where, I know that we're celebrating 40 years. In another 40 years, what should we have accomplished? What are the challenges that face us right now? And maybe that's too big of a question to ask at the very end, but what should we have accomplished in another 40 years?
Well, we should still be around. That's friend number one. That would be the major thing, is that people there would still be an American Folklife Center that really has a national role, and that is viable and is doing. I can't even imagine what 40 years from now is going to look like, but whatever it looks like, hopefully we would have been able to be nimble enough to go with the flow.
I think that this came up in passing earlier, but one of the things I was proudest of before I retired is helping to get permanent authorization for the center. That is,
it's major.
When it was first created by the Congress, it was created, but it had to be reauthorized every 3 years or so by the Congress, again, as if it were a temporary program and needed reevaluation, and perhaps it did. But getting to the point with the Congress where they decided, all right, we don't have to fight about this anymore, you know. And the person in the Congress who did it more than any single person, Thad Cochran of Mississippi, Republican senator from Mississippi. He was our guy. He got it through for us, and I think that affected Peggy's job.
Oh, yeah.
And Betsy's job.
It's major.
You know, and in a way turned
Major.
it not into a conversation about whether, but a conversation about what. And what you do, you can't always know in particular terms, but if you're there institutionally, you'll be there when new things like veterans history or StoryCorps present themselves, and the director, you know, will deal with them as they come along, or maybe even invent one for the center, because inventing directions is good too, but most of the time, you know, the world is busily doing things, and if you watch the world carefully, you'll pick up ideas for where the future ought to be, you know, and inventing really doesn't have to do with invention from scratch, but from catching cues by paying attention to what's going on in the world about us.
Did you want to weigh in on the future?
I
on
always, when people ask those
2056?
questions in sort of strategic planning exercises, or, you know, envision where you're going to be, I just, because I never quite know what to say. Yes, we'll still be around. The orphan works legislation will be passed, and we will be able to easily get more material up online, or make it more and more accessible to people. Also, the means in which we'll be bringing stuff in will probably make it accessible more immediately. That we will continue figuring out how to balance face-to-face interaction with tools of technology that will allow us to, I hope, work at a scale that we just haven't been able to quite manage yet, I think, and I don't know.
We'll check back in after strategic
Yeah,
planning.
well, and what I think the tools can make us work more collaboratively with communities than we've been able to do. I mean, the impulse and the ability to do that is always there, again, in small scale or targeted ways, but I think, you know, there are potential means for us to really more actively bring people into our archives. I mean, to actively, you know, engage and impact the stuff that's coming in. And I would hope to see, yeah, that happening a lot, all the time.
Do we have time for a couple more questions? I don't know how we're doing. One more question?
One half
All right.
question.
Make it a good one.
All right. No pressure.
I'll ask a question. So as somebody that started my dissertation research here, obviously the collection has provided, you know, all kinds of not only materials, but also methodological ideas for scholars and students and so forth. But I wonder if each of you could comment on a time when the collection meant something for a culture bearer that came in and discovered something by surprise. I know I've heard lots about repatriation and so forth, but maybe just, you know, an afternoon that made your day when somebody wandered into the archive and found something that was actually, by extension, theirs.
George Clinton. Oh, well, except he didn't wander into the archive, actually, but yes, George Clinton came to visit, and I got my photo taken with him, so I was extremely thrilled. Actually, about 2 months after I started a woman, older woman, and her grandson, I guess, came in to the archive to listen to, he brought her in from Baltimore to listen to her StoryCorps interview. And Anne was there, and there were 3 or 4 of us, but it was her birthday. And we all went and we stood around her and sang happy birthday to her. And it was just, she was beaming. It was just, it was wonderful. It was just a sweet little moment.
That's nice.
Oh, go ahead.
I thought of, for some reason this popped in my mind. Mary Hufford and others in our office did a project in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And in the process, they had, this was a multi-person project, and I can't even tell you who the field worker was, but one of the field workers in that project got engaged with a small African-American community that was Jewish, you know, and Jewish and African-American. And thus, from the general American's point of view, kind of an anomalous, who are these people really? Well, they're what they are, you know.
12th tribe of
But,
Israel.
at some point thereafter, I was director of the center, but I happened to be in the reading room of the archive when a man from this community came in. And you could tell from his body language that he was anxious, like he knew these people had come and recorded and photographed them. Did it really go where it was said to go, to the Library of Congress? And what was it? You know, that somehow seeing it there was reassuring to him, but he was filled with anxiety. And I said, oh, truthfully, I didn't know that myself, and so we looked into it, and there they were, the recordings and the photographs of this community. And we pulled them out, and he got to look at them, and he nodded, oh, there's so-and-so, there's so-and-so. And you could feel the anxiety turn to relief, you know, as he thought, this really was the Library of Congress coming to document us, you know, and this is really us, and now it's here, you know, and it's a good thing. And for some reason, that because of the transition from anxiety to joy, you know, it made me feel good and remember the moment. So.
Well, there's many moments, you know, with members of Congress as well as with people who would just stop into my office and want to just talk about the material that their family had given. But I have to say, you know, I came here in 1999. It was a different Capitol Hill. A year and a half later, 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, it was tough. But I can't remember now, maybe the staff will help me. We had a meeting, and because they didn't close the office. For God's sakes, the Pentagon isn't on fire, and we're still showing up for work. So we show up for work, and I said, well, let's just have a meet. Let's go in the staff room and have a meeting, and think about how do we respond to this? Because at this point, you couldn't give blood because they had too much blood. You could give money, but you know, what could we do? And we came up with the idea of the 9/11 collection project, and we just asked people, sent out, I think Anne was in charge of sending out a blast email to people around the country saying, if you have a recorder, go out and talk to somebody in your own community right now. What are they feeling about this? And I did field work. I took a recorder home to Tacoma Park, Maryland, and talked to a neighbor I had never talked to before. She was from India, and her mom was from India and lived with her, an elderly Indian woman who always walked around the neighborhood in her sari, and she was terrified to go outside because of repercussions. And I think that was one of the things I think that we as folklorists are so privileged to be able to help people navigate these horrible divisions that come up where people want to divide us. And so that probably is my moment.
I think that's a nice moment maybe to conclude on. Does that sound good? Should we give a round of applause to thank you. Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, we will have to get a photo of the three of us. But at the end of the board meeting that just concluded, Pat Atkinson presented this to us, commissioned by a leatherworker artist, traditional.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah,
Worker
really
from
Nevada.
And it will certainly go up into our conference room or reading room or somewhere. But we're very thrilled.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday, yeah.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.